So today we're going to talk about Pure Land Buddhism, but before we get into that, just a bit of background. So Buddhism exists in, broadly speaking, three different branches, or really two depending on how you want to classify Tantra. Originally, of course, much like Christianity and Islam, while the Buddha still lived, there was only one religious tradition, what eventually became known as Buddhism. And actually, it's interesting because after the Buddhas died, they actually had a Buddhist council that codified, I believe, the Pali Canon, the Eightfold Path, and the Four Noble Truths. But that's kind of a story for another time. It was kind of like the Council of Nicaea, I guess, is the closest parallel. But very early on, two distinct branches emerged: Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. Now, Theravada Buddhism is what's practiced in Indochina, and it by and large de emphasizes worship of deities, of the supernatural in general. It's much more about individual enlightenment. It's much more about enlightenment is something that can only be achieved by monks and by a lifetime of asceticism. It also kind of rejected that the religion could develop any further after the death of the Buddha, and they tend to be very kind of orthodox and very unchanging. A comparison people sometimes make is between Theravada and Puritanism. And I think another good reason for that is Theravadins will claim that they're the original Buddhism, and Mahayana is a corruption that incorporated a lot of syncretic elements. But when you think about something like Puritanism is something that emerged like 1500 years after Christ died. So it is kind of a new phenomenon that is fundamentalist or restorationist in character. So what I'm trying to say is just because something's austere and simplified and it has everything else stripped down doesn't necessarily mean it's older, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's closer to the original intent. And then the other branch that developed was Mahayana Buddhism, which is very diverse. It developed into a large number of traditions, one of which we'll be talking about today, which is Pure Land Buddhism. And then there's also Tantra, which is the development of Mahayana Buddhism, which is practiced in Tibet and I believe among some of the Mongolian people. But anyways, in contrast to Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism embraced the worship of deities, specifically of Buddhas, and we'll talk about that a bit more once we get into Pure Land Buddhism. It focused more on the community. It focused more on seeking enlightenment in everyday life, that by living a virtuous life and living kind of your normal life in line with Buddha principles, you could accumulate karma and bring yourself closer to enlightenment. Obviously, becoming a monk or an ascetic made you get to enlightenment faster, but it was believed within Mahayana Buddhism that salvation was something available to all people and not just to monks. And like I said, it was more communally focused. It also was more adaptable. In particular, when it went into China, it syncretized very easily with Taoism. Mahayana Buddhism is very good at syncretism. And when it entered China and Japan, we had a branch of Buddhism developed that's called Pure Land Buddhism. Now, it's interesting because as I'm going through the Great Course lecture series on Buddhism, the immediate thing I noticed once we got to Pure Land Buddhism was how similar it was in a lot of ways to Christianity. I suppose more specifically you could compare it to Reformation Protestantism, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, I'd like to preface this by saying, obviously, they're not the same thing. There's some very definitive theological differences. The Pure Land Buddhists don't believe that Amita Buddha is the uncreated creator. They don't believe he's a god in kind of the same way Christians believe Jesus is a god. Pure Land Buddhism is much less judgmental. For instance, we'll get to this in a second, but it's salvation for all people, both good and evil, and the Pure Land is not a place of judgment. I'd imagine that the wicked stay there for a longer period of time, but ultimately, it's not like Amita Buddha will come at the end of the world and judge with fire and sword. So there are a number of different Buddhas involved within Pure Land Buddhism. The main one is Amita Buddha. So the background for Amita Buddha is he lived countless lives. And during his countless lives, he made a vow, which is known as the 48 vows, and in which he vowed if he became an enlightened one, if he became a Buddha, he would exist solely for the purpose of leading other people to enlightenment. And specifically, he would do that by developing the Pure Land. Now, this is an interesting concept in Buddhism. I think the best way to understand it is Buddhas can create pocket dimensions for themselves. If you've ever know anything about mist with the books, it's a bit like that. A Buddha can create a pocket dimension that like people can go to. It's kind of like a world unto itself. It's basically a private heaven that's floating in the primordial universe. So Amita Buddha, through thousands, maybe even billions of lifetimes, they believe that he came from a previous incarnation of the earth, accumulated what is described as infinite karma. And once he reached enlightenment and became a Buddha, he created the Pure Land. So the Pure Land is a place where people can go when they die, in which they aren't reborn again. Once you die and you go to the Pure Land, you stay there until you achieve enlightenment. You don't have to be reborn. You don't have to go through any of kind of the other stuff. You get to stay there, and you can stay there until you become a Buddha, and you just either, I guess, kind of hang out there and help other people, other souls who arrive. And I know Buddhism has a different concept of the soul, but this is people in my audience are more familiar with Christian terminology. Who help the other souls who arrive there achieve enlightenment, or you can become a Bodhisattva, which I'm probably mispronouncing, which is kind of the ultimate goal in Mahayana Buddhism. My reading is it's almost better to be a Bodhisattva than to be a Buddha. So what is the difference? Both have achieved enlightenment. A Buddha remains, I guess, in kind of his transcendent form and doesn't return to earth in another body, whereas the Bodhisattva allows himself to be reincarnated so he can lead people to enlightenment on earth. And from my understanding of Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva is considered even greater because of his infinite compassion for other people. So basically, like I said, all the people exist within this pocket dimension, which is generated by the infinite karma of Amita Buddha. So how do you get to the Pure Land? You might be saying, this sounds like a pretty good deal. And it is, because like I said, it's your own merits don't matter to get to the Pure Land. All that matters is personal faith in Amita Buddha. And this should start to sound kind of familiar, because it is. Basically, the fundamental practice, particularly within the most kind of simplified version that was popular in Japan, is religious practice in Pure Land Buddhism is to chant Amita Buddha's name and to say, I go to refuge in him, I commit myself to him, etc. There's a series of mantras. But on the whole, they're not dissimilar, once again, to the kind of Christian mantras that you might see. Like in Orthodox Christianity, they have prayer ropes, and on each knot in the rope, you go, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me as a sinner. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me as a sinner. Or Hail Marys or something, and it's a bit like that. One of the 48 vows Amita Buddha said is, if people call upon me to save them 10 times, then I will save them. So if you place absolute faith in Amita Buddha, the ideal is to die with his name on your lips and to die with him as the last thought in your mind. Then you will be taken to the Pure Land. And this proved immensely popular, particularly among the lower classes, as all that was required was personal faith. You didn't require all the study, all this other stuff. You didn't have to become a monk. All that was required, like I said, was to believe in Amita Buddha. And it was described, I think, as the highest goal is to allow his mind to penetrate your heart and to feel his love for you. Once again, this should all sound very familiar. This does sound in a lot of ways like Christianity, especially like Reformation Protestantism, salvation by faith alone. Your own works don't matter. All that matters is that God is all-powerful and he will save you. Once again, Amita Buddha is not the creator God. He's not all-powerful. but he's a being of near limitless power, and because he can control your afterlife and grant you eternal salvation, he might as well be an all-powerful God. For all intents and purposes, he's as important. So it's interesting because the Japanese branch, at least the more kind of radical one, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term, that developed, actively rejected scholarship, actively rejected ceremony, and to a certain extent rejected monasticism. The focus was to take the religion to the streets, to bring the message of Amita Buddha to the common people, to get them to start chanting his name, to save them. Once again, it sounds very much like evangelical, I guess you could say, Christianity. And I'll do another video talking about kind of the broader similarities. But Buddhism was the first great missionary religion. I think a lot of people don't really understand this because it's the other side of the world. But at one point they had converted most of China, Indochina, and Japan and Korea, which is what, like a third of the world's population or something. It just doesn't seem as big a religion because China has had decades of state-imposed atheism, as has Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Although I don't think they're particularly repressive of Buddhism in Vietnam. I think they were in Burma, but that's neither here nor there. But they were able to go out and convert, and to a certain extent the message was one of salvation, of this will free you from the pains of life. And interestingly, Pure Land Buddhism became particularly popular among prostitutes, criminals, the dregs of society. And in fact, the founder of Pure Land Buddhism in Japan, or I guess kind of the reform branch of it, said in some ways salvation is easier to attain by the poor, by the wretched, because they have no grace and no merit of their own. They can't even attempt to achieve enlightenment on their own. So they have to place their absolute faith in Amita Buddha. And they're more dependent on his love. Once again, this kind of reminds you a bit of the tale of the rich man and Lazarus. Whereas and Jesus talked about this, it's easier in some ways for the poor and destitute to achieve salvation because they have nothing but me. They have nothing but their faith. And to a certain extent, it kind of makes them closer to God. And in this case, poverty, etc., makes you closer to Amita Buddha. Like I said, morality doesn't really enter into this. I guess because Amita Buddha generates infinite karma, kind of like how Jesus generates infinite grace, all of that will be washed away in the Pure Land. My understanding is in anime, whenever they talk about heaven, they're normally referring to Pure Land, the Pure Land. I believe in Naruto, actually, the afterlife is called the Pure Land. I think I wouldn't be surprised if Kishimoto was a Buddhist, because there are a lot of Buddhist themes in Naruto. But that's generally speaking what the Japanese are referring to when they talk about it. Because Buddhism syncretizes very easily with other religions, so it was able to syncretize with Shinto fairly easily. And in a lot of cases, monarchs like having clerical religions because they're useful, because normally once they kind of patronize the clerical religion, it'll unconditionally support them, and it provides a natural source of educated people. Particularly educated celibate people are very useful because they can't have children, and their interests are kind of like the interests of the state, sort of like Varis. But I'm getting off topic. So that's basically Pure Land Buddhism. If I wasn't a Christian, I'd probably be a Pure Land Buddhist, just because it's very similar in a lot of ways. Obviously, there's a lot of differences, terminology, etc. But what I'm trying to focus on is, in my view, what the core of it is compared to the core of Christianity. What kind of the central idea is, not how it's expressed necessarily, not what the specific theology says. So I think it's a very interesting religion, and one I have a great deal of respect for. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm going to do some other videos on Buddhism, and God bless. I'll talk to you guys later.